Great. Hi. So my name is Miguel Penabella. The name of my talk today is The Politics of Driving Queerly, Policing Movement and Urban Spaces in Roundabout. So this project is loosely based on an article entitled Queerness and Movement for my Open World column that I actually wrote for the video games criticism publication Haywire magazine. The thoughts I'm presenting today are still synthesizing in my mind as I expand the original article into a broader academic project for the purposes of today's presentation. So as such, if anyone has any kind of suggestions for further readings or scholars to turn to, I'll be happy to hear them out during our Q&A. Driving games, as an object of inquiry at the intersections of queerness and game studies, is infrequently examined with such themes in mind. However, if we are to think queerly about games, then turning to the genre's core element of gameplay, movement through space, yields relevant, indeed pressing themes, including mobility, collision, urbanism, exclusion, and surveillance. Beyond issues of representation, a closer investigation of gameplay mechanics and game spaces offers an avenue into thinking more broadly about urban queer histories and theories and its overlap with game design. To demonstrate how the content and mechanics of driving games can speak to broader questions of queer experiences in urban life, I propose a thorough investigation and close reading of developer No Goblin LLC's 2014 game Roundabout. So this project argues that Roundabout, a game rarely acknowledged as conveying queer themes, effectively communicates ideas of queer subjectivity and marginalization in an allegorical narrative about being queer and not belonging in an intolerant society. So the questions that this project asks concern how the game's mechanics, narrative, and design speak to and disrupt issues of queerness. How does Roundabout explore themes related to embodied queerness and queer spaces? What can driving games teach us about such themes? What are the underlying values asserted? And how is this game situated within a broader history and scholarly discourse in queer urban spaces more broadly? Answering these questions requires a closer examination of literature beyond the scope of video games in order to bridge the medium with critical work in urban studies, sexuality and visual culture, and queer readings of roadways and urban versus suburban and rural spaces. In doing so, I propose that driving games provide fresh ways in thinking about queerness, and I offer frameworks to better locate video games within a broader discourse on urban citizenship, governance, automobiles, and mobility. In Roundabout, players maneuver protagonist Giorgio Manos' constantly revolving limousine through a crowded city strewn with traffic, barriers, trees, and other obstacles, while chauffeuring passengers to their destinations. The game requires players to readjust their preconceived notions of movement in a game space and rethink how such forms are often coded as normal. The disconnect between Giorgio's unorthodox movement and her surrounding physical environments is where queer themes are most inventively expressed. Giorgio Manos doesn't conform to the normalized behavior of driving straight. Indeed, the double meaning of straightness, both in terms of one's direction on an axis and one's sexual orientation, is ambiguously referenced throughout the game, and she thus serves as an outsider among the cautious residents of the eponymous Roundabout city. And here I'd actually like to pause and play a trailer for the game to better visualize its central gameplay, because I think the images kind of lend themselves to being watched. Bear with me for a second.
Hi there, Giorgio Manos?
Meet Giorgio Manos, the world's first revolving limousine driver. See, there's only one way this ship will run, and it's with a twist. Giorgio never stopped revolving. As a kid, Giorgio learned to move with the spin instead of fighting it.
Wow, kid. Have you ever thought of going pro?
People, small obstacles, nothing could stop Giorgio from twisting and turning.
Giorgio and Disco Sylvan are going to go far. Home run! See, that's how you do it.
Little did Giorgio know that a curveball was about to land in the back seat.
Oh, when I take over the world as the best evolving limousine driver, I will crush your precious limousine last.
You got this, baby. Teach this Eiffel turkey a lesson.
With a limo license, the world was Giorgio's oyster. Passengers everywhere would experience a true revolution in transportation. But at what cost?
Great. I do love this game. It's awesome, and I recommend people play it. But yeah, for the purposes of this project, so by emphasizing the awkwardness of movement through public spaces by protagonists who are currently charged with not driving straight, Roundabout suggests that movement is constantly under surveillance and that deviations from the norm are socially and politically transgressive. Only a few publications have acknowledged the game's allegory of outcasts who move through hostile spaces while refusing to conform, including a Slant review and a Kill Screen article that identifies the game as specifically about queerness. It is this lack of critical acknowledgement that this project aims to correct with a deeper investigation of the game at the crossroads of urban spaces, mobility, and queerness. Indeed, automobiles in urban spaces have been a valuable gateway for queer scholarship, as cultural historian Catherine Goodis writes regarding American roadways. Quote, the automobile and the highway offered an ideal liminal space in which travelers could play out desires far from the workaday realities of their own lives, identities, histories, or current political and economic situation. As a transitional space outside of the fixed boundaries of home and work, the road symbolically suggested that one's own identity must also be in flux, open to reinvention or at least the possibility of refashioning, end quote. Roundabout's gameplay reveals tensions between queerness and established boundaries by a dominant norm. Giorgio Manos begins driving while being watched, judged, and evaluated by a DMV driving instructor who measures how well she can integrate within prescribed rules and boundaries established by the city. The narrator explains that Giorgio's revolving method of driving is unconventional. However, the protagonist owns her identity and is unapologetic about it, despite the instructor's warning to just keep things straight. If we are to think of her unconventional driving style as coded as queer, we can consider English scholar Christopher Reed's theorization of the visual signifiers of queer spaces in his 1996 essay, Imminent Domain, Queer Space in the Built Environment, wherein the suburbs are where, quote, difference is accommodated as long as it is kept out of sight, end quote. Playing things straight suggests a lack of confrontation with queerness. Reed refers to deferring one's behavior to the perceived community consensus, where queerness is not visibly marked. In theorizing queer spaces in American cities, Reed notes that landscapes are not accommodating to queer residents who had to camouflage their businesses and social spaces to protect from stigmatization in the mid-century, including, quote, barriers, curtain windows, and intimidating signage, end quote. He calls this design maze-like, and this urban design and architectural ethos reappears in Roundabout, a game about secrecy, blending in, and moving around the predetermined strictures of a city not designed with the safety and distinct mobility of Giorgio in mind. So Giorgio moves around the many obstacles of the game, but crashing into solid walls and barriers can destroy the limousine and cause it to explode after just 4 or 5 hits. Reed notes that an overarching concern with fashioning queer space is, quote, opening smaller spaces into larger ones, end quote, where, quote, metaphors of knocking down barriers and opening up closets are clearly relevant to queer identity, end quote. This is a consideration of queer space not as stable, but as mobile and malleable, what he calls imminent, where, quote, queer space is space in the process of, literally, taking place, of claiming territory, end quote. In Roundabout, Giorgio's limousine can tear down smaller barriers, like breakable fences, hedges, and traffic cones, that regulate and enclose her environment. The game rewards destruction of these smaller objects with points, thus playing into these notions of queer space as smashing barriers and claiming territory. Giorgio eventually pursues a blossoming romance with frequent passenger Beth, who in the game's full-motion video cutscenes expresses enthusiasm towards a revolving limousine rather than the animosity or cautiousness of other characters. Beth convinces Giorgio to escape the suburbs and move to the bustling downtown of Roundabout City, where she thinks Giorgio's spinning will be better received. It's in the city where Giorgio initially encounters other cars that revolve like hers, suggesting a more inclusive open space. Indeed, urban spaces are frequently framed as queer enclaves with some degree of inclusivity, representing what scholar Karen Tongson argues as, quote, a privileged site of sexual diversity, end quote, in contrast with the heteronormative nuclear families that characterize rural and suburban spaces. Even Giorgio's move to the city mimics Tongson's identification in her book on queer relocation in suburbs, that, quote, what has long been common lore about the different spatial circumstances of gays and lesbians, that gays lived in hip neighborhoods in world cities, while lesbians generally have to traverse some bridge, tunnel, or undesirable stretch of freeway to participate in urban life, has recently been affirmed by data in the Gay and Lesbian Atlas, end quote. In Roundabout, Giorgio traverses a tunnel that connects suburban to urban life, relocating through space as a means to fulfill a desire to be part of a broader body politic. At the same time, however, the city can also be a site of intensified surveillance and policing. When a mid-act twist reverses the good fortune of Giorgio, the city shuns her limousine driving after an unfortunate accident, exiling her to a snowy countryside hideaway after numerous police run-ins. Her driving is eventually policed by pursuing law enforcement, cementing ideas of systemic bodily control by institutions, and further narrowing Giorgio's space of movement in public areas. The city coincides with urban studies scholars David Bell and John Binney's identification of, quote, the prime site where difference is encountered, end quote. Some forms of sexual identity are seen as more appropriate than others, and others are excluded as, quote, the queer unwanted, end quote, where sites like cruising grounds are policed and deviant. Giorgio is only accepted when she commodifies her difference and offers her labor as a limousine driver. When she disrupts the rhythm of the city by tearing down building structures and crashing into other cars, the city turns hostile because of this sudden confrontation with visible queerness. Antagonistic police cars are dispatched to surveil the streets because she's disruptive. This conflict with police mirrors what scholar George Chauncey notes in his writings on sexuality and urban culture in New York City, in which queer communities historically came under attack, quote, because they challenged bourgeois conceptions of public order, the proper boundaries between public and private space, and the social practices appropriate to each, end quote. It is this disruptive, confrontational violence that I now turn to. To borrow game scholar Bonnie Ruberg's language, Roundabout is a game that hurts. The fragility of the car and the relentless obstacles that block the path result in the frustration of frequent game overs, thus de-emphasizing fun and resembling closely what Ruberg calls no-fun games that involve, quote, a system of disruptive counter-affects, end quote. To play Roundabout is to feel the embodied collisions and explosions of the game as the limousine's awkward movements come into violent contact with hard surfaces. Using Ruberg's taxonomy, this is a game that hurts by design, where, quote, suffering is built into the core mechanics, end quote, and devastating crashes and impact is inevitable and infuriating. One of the closest analogs to Roundabout is Limb, the 2012 game by transgender woman developer Merritt Kopis, in which players navigate a flashing multicolored square through a hostile environment of brown and navy blue squares that seek to shun the player outside the maze-like space. Just like in Roundabout, players awkwardly maneuver and fit through tight slots, while considering how movement can be coded in certain ways that are deemed normal. Your square will inevitably collide with hostile squares that are both repelled by the player's presence but are also violent towards it, and players can press a button to blend in and pass as whatever color conforms to that space. Players can be pursued, trapped, or even knocked outside the corridors of the game altogether, suggesting a reading of Limb as a game about the public monitoring of queer bodies, transgender experiences, and any number of other marginalized identities locked in systems of oppression. Limb is a non-fun game that hurts and disrupts. Those who've played the game have described its harsh noise and trembling camera as other squares strike the player character as, quote, annoying and super stressful, end quote, and not as a pleasurable experience. The game's disinterest in satisfying normative gameplay pleasures reflects Merritt Kopis' thoughts on embodiment in which the player feels the, quote, visceral effects, end quote, of shaking and being hit. Comparably, movement in Roundabout is mired in violence and surveillance, where clashes with police and obstacles erupt in the instant death of a fireball. Playing the game is frustrating and embodied affair that renders players' movements potentially violent, destructive, and transgressive. Indeed, what Roundabout and Limb ultimately share is an emphasis on movement as a crucial queer theme, allegorizing the experience of transgender, homosexual, and other queer individuals passing in a society that is intolerant, judgment, and prone to violence against anyone who deviates from an established norm. In Roundabout, the means to overcome such oppressions is through the gradual acceptance of Giorgio's allegorical queerness. As an uncertain Beth admits, quote, I thought I would be okay with this, but I just can't deal with all this twisting and turning around everything. Can you just be straight with me? End quote. Beth convinces Giorgio to cease spinning and attempt driving straight. After hours of mastering the rhythms of constant revolving, suddenly driving straight feels palpably awkward. It's much harder to traverse the familiar landscape while passing as a straight car. Rather than fluidly flowing around a barrier or dancing between parked vehicles, Giorgio now has to inch around it and slalom through obstacles with sluggish discomfort. The narrator admits that for Giorgio, quote, driving straight felt wrong, end quote. And Beth eventually drops her request, conceding that Giorgio should just be herself and revolve. driving games, while seemingly innocuous, can be intensely political and speak to questions of queerness. If we are to think queerly about games and bridge the medium to broader ideologies and criticism, then any single element of a video game should be open to deeper analysis. The subtext is there to be found and meaning to be parsed from the images and mechanics provided, whether it be the difference between a limousine revolving or driving straight. Many other driving games can be reconsidered in queer contexts, including Driver San Francisco's car-shifting mechanics, which enable players to swap bodies across male and female drivers and experience a sense of endlessly mutable identities, or Burnout Paradise and its emphasis on collision and punishment. Locating queerness in driving games offers us fresh perspectives and critical approaches to examine the medium, thus broadening the potentialities of our discourse. Thank you.